Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Schmidt, a professor in the psychology department at Simon Fraser University and chair of the department's Indigenous Reconciliation Committee. I'm a settler here, born in what is now called Virginia, and I'm humbled and grateful to live and work on the ancestral territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam peoples. Very excited to have Dr. Cornelia Wyman speaking with us today and to have such an excellent turnout. Thank you everyone for coming. I would ask that during the talk that you keep your videos off until the Q&A to minimize distractions. And I would like to now ask Elder Sequalia if she would please welcome Dr. Wyman and all of us to this land and to this virtual space that we're sharing together today.
There. Kayachkin, I welcome each and every one of you to Squamish Nation, Tsleil-Waututh. Oh, bless me, I'm sorry. In Musqueam ancestral traditional territories where you're zooming into, and Coquitlam. And I apologize again. I have allergies, and in the morning I tend to sneeze. And so my hands are up to each and every one of you for being here today. And I'm honored to be able to open the event for my dear sister, friend, woman warrior, Dr. Cornelia Wyman. And, you know, just always think that it's awesome that the work that you do is always helping people to move forward in a good way in their lives. And also to be the voice for those who need to have, can't share. And you're the voices that can share when they need the help that they do. I'm going to, my elders believe that we all have an inner energy and force within us, and that the Creator sends energy through the top of our head. And then we can use our energy to heal ourselves if we believe strongly enough, or send energy to others through spiritual prayer to help them when they need it. And that you can't have your arms crossed, your hands like this or this, because you're blocking your energy. So I always ask people to do Tai Chi or yoga breathing, take a few breaths and just open your hands, get grounded. Take a few breaths. I'm going to do the Coast Salish anthem that late Chief Dan George had. It was his song, and his son Len George shared it with the Coast Salish nations, and the family did. And then they also shared it with he gifted it to FNHA, First Nations Health Authority, when he adopted FNHA into his Takaya Wolf clan. So while I sing, I ask you to please open your hearts and minds, your Shkwawan, and pray for each other, pray for the speaker, and pray for all your family and friends. Oh, hello. Orchika. Chen Quen Min Tomi Kakakanik Chasiam, Yoncio Tunoyap and Manman Disquals Deceits, Yoncio Manman Equatal Chet Siaya Chet Chwawan, Disquals Deceits, asking you, Creator, to watch over and protect each and every one of your children gathered here today and all their families and friends and communities, and help them with their squalwin, the feelings in their hearts and minds, their emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual well-being and health. Asking you, Creator, to also help all those who are going to be sharing their words, their snachum, to have their squalwin, their hearts and minds, speak from their hearts and minds in a good way and respectfully, and transfer knowledge, and to be able to share those words so that you hear it and take into your heart what's meant for you, set aside what you don't need today to bring back another day. So asking, Creator, for you to calm the schwalwin of all the speakers, especially Dr. Cornelia Wyman, help her words to come out in a good way. And also, Creator, asking you to hear our prayers for all our family and friends with serious illnesses, injuries, those waiting for surgery or those who have had surgery. Hear our prayers for all of them for their health, healing, and recovery. Asking and prayers also, Creator, for all of those who have anxiety and depression, as during the last over a year now, those things have got increased in people with the uncertainty of the time. So sending them healing prayers to help them in the days ahead. Asking prayers for all of our family and friends who have traumas and battle drugs and alcohol, whether it's illegal or legal drugs, and those who are homeless because of their traumas and battles. And asking you, Creator, to keep them all safe and to hear our prayers to help them find that healing path to wellness and recovery. Asking you, Creator, to hear our prayers for all our family, friends, communities that have lost loved ones and have AM squall and strong feelings of sorrow in their heart for the loss of their loved ones who are going home to the Creator and ancestors, and help them in their healing, to lift them up and help carry them through the days ahead as they say farewell to their loved ones. And know that our loved ones are always watching over us, guardians, and when we're low in spirit, they send dragonflies that many of our people believe are ancestors visiting, or maybe a hummingbird, eagle, raven, something you don't usually see that when you're low in your squalwin makes you smile and feel light of spirit. That's spiritual help from loved ones. So again, Creator, asking that today's work be yet one halt up, that today's work be an excellent work, and that we come together in Chomot and Squalwin with one heart and one mind to Chen Stwite, stand and work together to hold each other up, support one another, and help each other in the days ahead. Tamak Kwitsi Snachum, those are my words. Chen Quinmin Tomi, I'm grateful and thankful that you let me start this day with all of you in a good way. And Waiske, let's go.
Thank you so much, Elder Sequalia, for that beautiful welcoming and bringing us together in a good way. I'd like to let the audience know that today's talk was organized by the Indigenous Reconciliation Committee and the Department of Psychology. Following the TRC calls to action, our committee works to eliminate the marginalization and underrepresentation that Indigenous peoples experience in academic settings. One way we work toward these goals is by providing opportunities for students, faculty, and staff, as well as the broader community, to learn from Indigenous scholars and Indigenous knowledge holders, as we're doing today. You can learn more about the Indigenous Reconciliation Committee on the Psychology Department website. And now I'd like to pass the mic to another member of the IRC, Dr. Rochelle Fuladi, to introduce Dr. Wyman.
Thank you so much. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nell Wyman. Dr. Nell Wyman is the acting Deputy Chief Medical Officer for the First Nations Health Authority in British Columbia. She's Anishinaabe, Little Grand Rapids First Nation, which is in Treaty 5 territory, 270 kilometers northeast of Winnipeg. Dr. Wyman is an adopted member of the Takayo Wolf Clan First Nations Health Authority family and currently lives and works on the unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam Nations. Dr. Wyman completed her medical degree and specialization in psychiatry at McMaster University on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee Nations and the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. As the first female Indigenous psychiatrist in now Canada, Dr. Wyman has more than 20 years clinical experience working with Indigenous people in rural, reserve, and urban settings. She's served as president of the Indigenous Physicians Associations of Canada since 2016 and has chaired numerous national advisory groups. Over the years, Dr. Wyman has worked and taught in many academic settings and is currently an assistant clinical professor at McMaster University and an adjunct professor in the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University. Nell is exceptional in her scholarship and in her work and has been working diligently for and with communities in service of advancing their well-being. In particular, Dr. Wyman has been instrumental in the development and implementation of the First Nation Health Authority's approach to mental health and wellness, a top priority identified by BC First Nations in every region, and one which has been compounded by the overdose crisis and now by the COVID-19 emergency. We are sincerely thankful to Dr. Wyman for taking the time to provide this colloquium and to discuss with us her insights and reflections on a year in public health, the collision of 3 public health emergencies, the COVID-19 pandemic, the toxic drug poisoning crisis, and anti-Indigenous racism. Dr. Wyman, thank you.
Thank you, Rochelle, for that invitation, or for the introduction, and for inviting me to be here in the first place. Ani Buju to all of you. First, I want to start by thanking Elder Sequoia for being here with us today and raise my hands to her for that wonderful opening full of heart and spirit. These are challenging times all around, and yesterday also was National Awareness Day of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. So it's been a heavy time, and yet this is the 3rd time this week I've had the honor of working with Sequoia at an event. So I'm so glad to see you, and I always appreciate your teachings and opening us in a good way and setting this space. So thank you, Miigwech. I'm just going to share my screen, and it hopefully shouldn't take too long. There, is that working? So as Rochelle mentioned, I want to thank the Indigenous Reconciliation Commission as well for having me here this morning. And Rochelle already read out the title, so that's good. I don't have to do that. I will formally, in a way, introduce myself. So Ani, Bonjour. My name is Nell Wyman. I am originally from Little Grand Rapids First Nation in northeastern Manitoba, as was mentioned. I am a Anishinaabe Kwe, member of the Anishinaabe Nation. I'm a 60s scoop survivor. And recently I had the opportunity to meet virtually a second cousin of mine. And one of the things that's really important to us as Indigenous people, as First Nations people, is knowing who we are and where we come from. And so I didn't have this information until just recently, but now I can proudly share part of my lineage with you as what we typically do when we introduce ourselves. So my original birth name was Alana Green. My parents are Charlie Green and Marianne Duck. My paternal grandparents are Charles Green and Mary Jane Keeper. And what you'll see as I go through this presentation is, even though I use PowerPoint like many other people, I like to use a lot of artwork, pictures. I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes or so interspersing sort of what I know and what I've been working on over the past year with personal experiences and stories. Include some quotations from some of my favorite people or quotations that I find meaningful. And as I just did in sharing my lineage with you, I'm showing you or giving you an example of how somebody as an Indigenous person walks in those two worlds. So I'm a Western trained medical professional, but I am also a First Nations woman. And so I'm going to share both of those parts with you as I take you through this talk with me and share with you what's been going on. So just quickly, I want to just point out the pictures. The picture on the top left is one of vaccinations arriving in a remote First Nations community. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what we've been doing in that regard in a bit. The picture on the top right is from Moms Stop the Harm. And this is a group of moms and others, people who have directly suffered losses of children most often to the toxic drug poisoning crisis. And you'll notice as I go through that we have changed the language from using the opioid crisis and talking about overdoses partly out of respect for people with lived and living experience and people who have survived the loss of loved ones, like Leslie McBain, who's the founder of Moms Stop the Harm. Overdose implies it has that association with people who complete suicide or try to complete suicide. And that is not at all the case in the vast, vast, vast majority of people who are dying because of our toxic drug supply. And we're using toxic drug supply instead of opioids because not everybody experiences a toxicity related to drug use because of opioids. Nowadays, the toxic drug supply includes stimulants as well, and anti-anxiety medications, but I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a bit. The bottom picture is a rally that's meant to convey anti-Indigenous racism. And if you look really closely in the picture, that's a picture of Joyce Echaquan, who I hope most of you have heard about. Joyce Echaquan died in late September in Quebec under horrible circumstances. She was a patient in a hospital and managed to somehow have the wherewithal to record the last minutes of her life as she was being harassed and racially abused by two healthcare workers. And Joyce's loss is tragic, but and she will never know the impact that she has had on the healthcare system in British Columbia and across the country. So I always want to remember her. Oops. It's also important to give a land acknowledgement, and I probably should have done this a little bit earlier, but I will do it now. It's important for us to situate ourselves when we gather together in groups like this, to know where we are sitting, where we're centered, and who was here before us. So this is my land acknowledgement, and this is a picture I took in Pacific Spirit Park. I am Indigenous, not on my ancestral territory, and I respectfully acknowledge the land on which I work, live, and play is the traditional, ancestral, and continually occupied territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I said I was going to tell you some stories. So how did I get here? How did I end up working for First Nations Health Authority during a pandemic, during a toxic drug poisoning crisis, and during this recent increase in momentum to talking about anti-Indigenous racism? I mentioned at the top that I'm a 60 scoop survivor. So I was born in Manitoba, but I was adopted across the border into Northwestern Ontario, and I grew up with a Dutch couple. And you can see on the picture, the top left, excuse me, this is a picture of me when I was really little with my older sister, who is not related to me biologically, but she was also adopted from a different family. Her background is Polish. But I both love this picture because it's so, to me, it's entertaining because if you look closely, first of all, I'm super cute. But secondly, I am bare feet, holding a chicken. I look like I should be in a commercial of some sort. But I had a pretty hard scrabble upbringing. I was adopted by a Dutch family, parents who came to Canada after surviving the Nazi occupation in Holland during World War II. And so our home was filled with a lot of anxiety, and I believe my parents both had post-traumatic stress disorder from their experiences during the war. And so I don't know, people ask me, is that where you got your interest in psychiatry? I don't think so, but I think what it really made me attuned to quite quickly was how people around me were doing and feeling. I think I wouldn't want to say I was a sensitive child, but I was sensitive in the way that I was pretty tuned into how people were feeling. And, I don't know if that, like I said, I don't think it encouraged me to be a psychiatrist, but I definitely noticed that that's a skill that I tend to have. So I never saw myself as being a physician. I wasn't a particularly great student in elementary school or even high school. I went away to university mainly because I wanted to get away from home. I just wanted to get out of Thunder Bay where I grew up. So I got my guidance counselor to pick a course that wasn't offered at the local university. My parents had wanted me to stay at home. So I picked a course that wasn't offered there at home. And I did a bachelor's degree in kinesiology. And so my parents were like, we've never heard you speak about kinesiology. And I'm like, no, it's always been something that I've desperately wanted to study. So that's how I made my way to Southwestern Ontario, where I spent most of my young adulthood and actual adulthood until I moved to British Columbia about 3.5 years ago. But, and I guess we could talk about it more in the second hour of my time with you today. But I will tell you that part of the reason why I went into medicine was because I had a couple of people tell me that I shouldn't, or they didn't think I'd be very good at it, or they just didn't see me as being a doctor. And I think some of that actually had a little bit to do with racism. So my personality is, of course, a little defiant. So I was like, well, I'll show you. And that's how I kind of found myself in medical school. And given my background, I have a master's degree in biomechanics. psychiatry doesn't really roll off the tongue when you think of kinesiology and biomechanics. So I'm encouraging any students who are here at this talk, you know, it's a journey, not a destination. And I actually find my work that I did as part of my master's has been very helpful to me in my 20 years of clinical practice, because many psychiatric medications cause movement disorders or muscular side effects. And so that's been really valuable to me in my practice. But somehow or other, I made it through medical school. I made it through residency. And when I finished, I was the first Indigenous woman to train as a psychiatrist in Canada. I didn't know that I was the first woman. I think if I had known that, I don't know if it would have changed it really, but people ask me that question a lot, you know. I didn't do it to achieve being the first. I did it because I love psychiatry. I love that there was an art to practicing psychiatry as well as a science of psychiatry. And I think even back then there was that two-eyed seeing way, that sort of taking the best of Western science and using what I had innately as my Indigenous ways of being and knowing, and combining that into a role as working as a psychiatrist. So that gift I mentioned of growing up in a really tense, anxious household, I have come to understand as one of my gifts of intuition. And being able to feel people's emotions. And it's really hard to describe, you know, when you have those intuitions, especially when you're in a Western medical school model. And it's not like I can see the future or anything like that, but I would just, you know, say to my supervisor, well, I think this is what's going on. And they would be, well, based on what evidence? And I'd be like, well, based on these observations. And they, you know, sometimes I had trouble sort of explaining myself when I was doing my training. But nevertheless, I finished. The first 8 years of my career, I worked on in a reserve community, 6 Nations of the Grand River Territory. I was part of a group that worked at a brand new community-based mental health clinic. And that was really, again, working side by side with elders, which really wasn't done in Western medical services back then. And it was sort of, you know, it wasn't called cultural safety back then, but that's really what we were doing. We were trying to offer the most accessible, safe services to our patients as possible. And after that, I was there for 8 years, and then I accepted a position at the University of Toronto in the school, the Dalai Lama School of Public Health. And whenever I say the Dalai Lama School of Public Health, I always want to say Dalai Lama, but it isn't the Dalai Lama. It's the Dalai Lama family. And that's where I really became, I guess, a lot more interested again in research in my area, in my field. I had done research as part of my master's, but that sort of has always been something that I've been interested in. But after, and I did a little bit of clinical work with people who, Indigenous people who were HIV positive. But after 7 years of that, I was sort of restless again to try something new. So I went back to full-time clinical work, and I worked in a variety of programs. I worked with an urban outreach program where I saw people who were either vulnerably housed or homeless who needed assessments for long-term disability. And I also started working at a YWCA building that was just put up. It was a housing first initiative. So again, taking people who are vulnerably housed or homeless and giving them housing first and wrapping mental health supports around them. So there were 100 women, sorry, with serious mental health and addictions issues, and 50 Indigenous women-led families. And I worked as the psychiatrist, kind of on what was called a community assertive treatment team. But after about 3.5 years of what I called chasing my mischievous ladies around the downtown core of Toronto, I found that it was a little bit was a little bit too unpredictable for me after a while. So I decided I needed a bit more structure, and I took a job at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, which is Canada's largest mental health hospital, in downtown Toronto again. And I worked mainly in crisis psychiatry and in the emergency department. And I did some work with the Indigenous Services Program, some telepsychiatry, and some outreach to remote Northwestern Ontario. It's called the Sioux Lookout Zone. Very, very isolated group of communities up there. So I did sort of a smattering of different things. In the meantime, as my career developed, you know, as I said, there were very few Indigenous psychiatrists. So I ended up being asked a lot to speak on media, radio shows, TV shows, news outlets. As you'll see in the picture on the left-hand side, I've done this for many years. And I think it's important, as Sequalia mentioned, that those who have the ability to speak out for those who can't, there's an obligation, I feel, a responsibility to be representative of those voices. Not speak on their behalf, but bring their needs and their attention to light, and working together. And so it just came sort of as a natural sort of shift in my career. Evan Adams and I'm the president of the Indigenous Physicians Association, and Evan Adams is the vice president. He said to me in August of 2017, he said, "Hey, Nell, do you ever think about moving to Vancouver and coming to work for First Nations Health Authority?" And I went, "Oh, don't be silly. It's so rainy in British Columbia. Why would I ever go there?" And like 5 months later, I was on a flight with my family, like a one-way flight to Vancouver, starting my new job at FNHA. So I made the switch to public health just in time for a pandemic. And I no longer see patients clinically, but I certainly have had enough to keep me busy. So what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is take you through some of the things that I've been involved in. But bear in mind, there have been many, many people involved in this work. Hundreds of people work at First Nations Health Authority, and I am only one of those people. But I want to share some of the work that we've been doing and some of the work that the Indigenous Physicians Association has been doing. So I actually made a PDF of my slides, and I can mail them to Rochelle after this presentation if anybody's interested in having a copy. I'm not going to necessarily go through all the bullet points here, but I just wanted to show a timeline of COVID that in January 28th in 2020, the first confirmed case happened here in British Columbia, although the global pandemic wasn't declared by the WHO until March 11th last year. So we are now into the 15th month of this pandemic. A few days later, on March 17th, BC declared COVID-19 a public health emergency. And a day after that, BC declared a province-wide state of emergency, which we have continually been in. I think the state of emergency has been renewed now 20-something times in a row. The latest developments, of course, are the vaccines arriving in Canada in December and being authorized for use, rolling them out. And of course, the race against time in some ways against the variants of concern that have arisen. The UK variant, the Brazil variant, the South African variant, etc. And then, of course, the third wave that we are currently in. The latest numbers yesterday, I think we had 572 new cases provincially, which has come down. It's the lowest number we've had of daily new cases, I think, since March the 20th or something like that. And on the right-hand side, you'll see kind of my jokes, my lame attempts at trying to make jokes. Is my 2020 passport is to my bedroom, my bathroom, Facebook, the kitchen, and Zoom meetings. And that pretty much encapsulates my life over the last 15 months. I have been, working in public health has been a very interesting experience. It's been a lot of work, But at the same time, it's probably one of the most exciting times in my career, because you feel so immediately in some ways that you're doing things that are trying to make a difference for people. And the other two pictures are pictures I took in gas towns during the lockdown last March or April. And the one says, "Life is short and art long, the crisis fleeting, experience perilous and decision difficult." And the other one just is a thing about flattening the curve, and it says "introvert season," which is sort of me. Although even as an introvert, you know, the loss of social connection is really important. Has been, you know, very had negative impacts on people's mental health. I think for all of us. Just to give you a quick overview of COVID in Canada, I'm not going to read all these different numbers. We've had over 1.25 million cases in Canada, over 24,000 deaths, confirmed deaths due to COVID. In Canada, for First Nations altogether, we have had just over 27,000 cases. This is of 3 days ago, and we have had 318 deaths. And these are pictures along the bottom are some of our elders getting vaccinated. And the picture on the bottom right is vaccines arriving in a community with ceremony. So song, drumming, cedar brushing, smudging in cases. So it's really important that here in British Columbia, for BC First Nations, they have wanted, the communities want to do the vaccination in the way that makes the most sense to them. And so ceremonies have happened all across the province. And the graph just above these pictures is just to show you, this is from August of 2020 on the far left-hand side of the curve. And if you follow the red numbers, this was really the second wave, all the way through the winter, December, January, and then coming into the spring. You'll see the curve come down, even though we are, technically in a third wave. But what's made the difference here is the green, oh my God, I'm so tired, I can't even remember the word. Anyway, you'll see the tendency of the green are the vaccinations that we have delivered to First Nations communities across the country. And so there's a clear relationship you can see that as vaccinations have gone up, the number of new daily cases or active cases has come down. And so really we have made an extraordinary effort through vaccination as one of our tools to get us out of this pandemic, and especially protect our precious elders that you see at the bottom, who are our language holders, our knowledge keepers, the ones who hold the knowledge and share their knowledge about ceremonies and culture. So this is very important to us as First Nations people. Here's another picture of the vaccines on the left arriving in a community by float plane. So it really has been kind of planes, trains, and automobiles here in British Columbia to try to get all BC First Nations communities vaccinated. As I mentioned, the vaccines first arrived at around the end of December, and our goal at FNHA was to have first doses offered and delivered to all BC First Nations communities, those people who were eligible by March 31st of 2021. And we did that. We managed to meet that goal. We actually met it at 4 p.m. on March 31st, so no pressure there, leaving it to the last second, but we did get that done, and we've actually started rolling out second doses this week, and a few earlier the week before. But the second dose rollout is now underway. And the incredible, I can't take credit for any of this, the logistics involved in getting these vaccines to remote communities, like I said, have involved planes, trains, and automobiles. And just the math and calculation that goes into like every syringe that's needed, every Band-Aid that's needed, and most importantly, the human resources, you know, the nurses and other healthcare providers that are giving the vaccinations. And one of the things we had done early on, even before the vaccines were delivered across the country to start the vaccination process in Canada, there was a lot of discussion because of previous pandemics. H1N1, for example, in 2009, which wasn't necessarily handled in the best way regarding Indigenous people. Some of you may or may not recall body bags being shipped to First Nations communities in Manitoba. And so it was really critical for some Indigenous health leaders to strongly advocate to NACI, which is, you've heard that in the news, the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations, that Indigenous people be prioritized for vaccination during this COVID-19 pandemic. And Evan Adams and I, as part of the Indigenous Physicians Association, were asked to review the NACI guidelines even before the vaccines rolled out. And I can't tell you how much, like, there were iterations between Christmas Day and New Year's Day, and you'd get a draft back with like Indigenous populations struck out, and then we'd go, no, erase that, no, we're there. And then it'd come back, struck out. We're like, no, you're not getting it. This time around, we need to prioritize our populations and especially protect those elders. So that was one important piece of work that IPAC has done over the past year, is just be out there constantly advocating. And also, you know, when you think of urban Indigenous populations, here in BC, quite quickly, the rollout started to include urban people, urban Indigenous people 18 years and older. And other Indigenous physicians have had to do strong advocacy work across the country to have the same age groups vaccinated early, including Dr. Janet Smiley, who's a brilliant Métis physician researcher in Toronto, Dr. Lisa Richardson, who's Indigenous and works, she's an internal medicine specialist. She's working on the COVID wards and ICUs in downtown Toronto. And Dr. Marcia Anderson, some of you I'm sure have heard of Marcia. She's a superstar public health physician and a strong anti-racism advocate in Manitoba. So all of these, you know, as you see across the provinces, Indigenous people have been prioritized. Additionally, in British Columbia, one thing that we did a little bit differently than other provinces was we advocated for a whole of community approach. And by that, we meant we're not, in most cases, in some communities, because of the limited supply at a certain point in time, only 65 or 60 and older could be vaccinated. But in general, we took what's called a whole of community approach, meaning everyone who was eligible, 18 and older, got a first shot. And that could potentially also include non-Indigenous people who were partners or part of a family, and non-Indigenous workers who regularly had face-to-face contact with people. So nurses in communities, for example. And that was quite different than how it's rolled out in other provinces, but they felt that it was, the communities themselves felt it was really important for their own safety to have kind of this community bubble or whole of community bubble. So that's what we've aimed for to the best of our ability. We have a couple programs called Be a Vax Champ, trying to increase vaccine confidence. And again, you'll see pictures of how Indigenous specific clinics, even for the urban population, have attempted or have, you know, done their best to be culturally safe. I'll speed it up a little bit because clearly I can just go on and on about these things, but our public health response at FNHA involved everything from making sure communities had enough PPE, to setting up community-based testing sites, to modifying existing services to the virtual environment, to providing webinars around anything to do with COVID. And the one at the top right is a webinar that Dr. Terry Aldred, who's an Indigenous physician in British Columbia's northern region, did on vaccines to build vaccine confidence. And you'll see a picture of Sequoia there, who has, you know, been a part of so many events and has really been like an incredible support, even to me personally. And you'll also see two pictures of Dr. Kelsey Louie, who's from Tla'amin Nation, who's one of our senior medical officer at First Nations Health Authority, and he works in primary care with the virtual doctor of the day service. So a lot of these things had to really pivot and change how they were being offered. As Sequoia mentioned, I don't want to go again into a ton of detail, but this pandemic has been very hard on people, on their mental health and their emotional health. There's been so much unpredictability and uncertainty at times. Now concern about the variants, wondering how long is this actually going to go on for. You know, honestly, myself, you know, my thinking's changed over the last 15 months. I remember before the lockdown happened, we rented a car to just go hiking for the day. I don't own a car usually, so we rent from this place up our street. And the lady was like, "Do you think this is going to be super serious?" And at the time, it wasn't really. And I was like, "Oh, this will be over like soon. Don't worry." Like, I don't know what I was thinking, but that's the way, what we had to go on at the time. And I think that's one of the things that's made it really difficult is the messaging, the messaging keeps changing all the time because this is a novel coronavirus and because we can't really necessarily predict the future. But now that we have the vaccines, at least we have a tool to work towards getting ourselves out of this and moving into the recovery phase. I've already mentioned the trauma of past pandemics, some of the social determinants of health and inequities that put Indigenous people at particular risk of severe outcomes of COVID-19. For example, multi-generational families living in small households where it literally would be impossible to isolate if you had to go into quarantine, for example. And the disconnection that has happened by not being able to visit with one another, not being able to hug one another, not being able to gather for certain events and ceremonies. And there has been racism in the context of COVID. We've heard a lot of stories about people not being willing to, for example, come forward for testing if it meant going out of their communities to an urban, like even a small town or a larger urban setting if they could, because out of fear that they would be treated in a racist manner or treated in a negative manner. People were sometimes reluctant to disclose their contacts because they felt that they would be treated poorly. And seeking, there's been a lot of racism around clusters and outbreaks in certain communities, and we've seen this throughout the pandemic. The one that you may have heard about that received a lot of attention was in Cowichan, the Cowichan Valley, where grocery stores and restaurants were denying service to people who came from that community. And then, of course, there was the uproar around access to the vaccine. So we've received a lot of messages around, you know, why in fact do Indigenous people are they a priority? Why does an 18-year-old First Nations person get a vaccine when my 70-year-old mother is still waiting? That kind of thing. People not really understanding the context of the why we have some reasons to be at risk of more serious outcomes. And because of racism, people have sometimes been at home sick with COVID and wait too long to access help because, again, out of that fear of how they'll be treated. So this part of my presentation just basically brings together the COVID pandemic, I'm going to talk a little bit about the opioid, or what used to be called the opioid crisis, the toxic drug poisoning crisis, and a little bit about anti-Indigenous racism. And just looking at the time, I'll have to fly a bit. This is a graph that's probably a little bit too detailed to see all the figures, but if you want the PDF, you can have it. This is comparing the first 5 months of 2020 with the first 5 months of January of 2019. And we are just weeks away from publicly releasing our toxic drug poisoning data in the next couple of weeks. So I can't share those numbers with you. But in this particular infographic that we put out, our deaths due to toxic drugs increased by 93% from 2019 compared to 2020. And our proportion, First Nations people represented in deaths went from 9.9 in 2019 to 16% in the first 5 months of 2020. So what happened was there was a very significant negative unintentional consequence of COVID-19 colliding with the toxic drug poisoning crisis. Services had to stop, harm reduction services, overdose prevention sites, counseling, treatment centers closed. The messaging was, physically distance. And so people started to use alone. And so what we saw was this explosion where we had actually over 4 years since the toxic drug poisoning has been declared a public health emergency, the second one in our province. The rates were starting to come down in 2019. Then the pandemic hit, and 2020 has literally been our worst year ever. And we have, in fact, lost more people to death by toxic drug poisoning than we have to COVID-19. And that's partly because, the messaging that's out there, the stigma associated with using substances, whether it's, just one time experimenting in a social situation, because toxic drug deaths have happened in that scenario as well. It's not always, who we think of when we think of people who die of toxic drug poisoning deaths. Just go to the Mom Stop the Harm website and you'll see for yourself. But the messaging, the sort of underlying messaging is laden with stigma when it comes to people who use substances. So in COVID-19, the message is all like, be calm, be kind, be safe. We're all in this together. But when we're talking about the toxic drug poisoning crisis, the message really is kind of, I'm glad it's you and not me. That's not my problem. That's not something that has to do with me. That doesn't touch my life. So we're not all warm and fuzzy together. And one of the biggest things I feel most passionate about, and I don't have an answer to the question, is how do we get people to care in the same way about people who use drugs to people, for example, who have been sick with COVID-19. So FNHA has a framework for action, and the only thing I'll focus on this slide is that everyone needs a confusing, unreadable slide in their PowerPoint presentation, and this is it. It's totally illegible probably to you on this screen, but basically our framework for action is on 4 prongs, each building upon each other. So one of them is prevent people, and this is old language in this graphic, prevent people who overdose from dying. So people who are actually using toxic drugs, keep people safer when using, create an accessible range of harm reduction and treatment options, and supporting people on their healing journey, whatever that looks like, whether they're actively engaged in a harm reduction program or a treatment program and are working toward being abstinent. There have been so many things that actually have happened over the past year in terms of the toxic drug crisis. I could give a whole talk on that, around expanded nurse prescribing in British Columbia, pharmaceutical alternatives that are prescribed to create a safe supply for people and separate them from those very toxic drugs that are available for sale on the street. I'm coming to the end now, and I know I'm a little bit over time, but I will try to wrap this up. I want to talk about the undeclared third public health emergency. And I've talked a little bit about it when I've talked about my journey, about COVID-19, about the toxic drug poisoning crisis. This is Murray Sinclair, the Honorable Murray Sinclair. He was the chair of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He was also a senator, just recently retired. And I think now he has become the chancellor of, I think it's Carleton University. I can't remember the university, but so he's a total underachiever. You can see that by his qualifications, but I love many of the things that he says. And this is partly the crux of how we got to such a place where anti-Indigenous racism is systemically pervasive in Canadian society. While Indigenous children were being mistreated in residential schools by being told they were heathen, savages, and pagans and inferior people, that same message was being delivered in the public schools of this country. And indeed, in sharing my own story with you, that is partly what happened, what I went through as a 60 scoop survivor. And as any Indigenous person, even if I wasn't a 60 scoop survivor, I was never particularly encouraged in elementary school. I was never identified as someone who could potentially be a physician. I wasn't particularly encouraged in any way to excel. And I hope that that's changing over time, because that is systemic racism. I like including this slide because this is an amazing art project that you can Google. It's called the Perception Series, and the author is Casey Adams. And it's these pictures that are juxtaposed side by side of a typical stereotype of Indigenous people on the left-hand side, and then the truth on the right-hand side. And there's so many of them in this project, but I picked Stoic Indian to show you because that's a common stereotype, and one that I actually heard a lot about when I was training in medicine. Well, you people are so stoic all the time. And, you know, if I watched this presentation back on video and sped it up into fast forward, like my face is probably all over the place as I've been talking to you. I am nothing like a Stoic Indian, and neither is Mingan Linklater. He's Anishinaabe, a father, a son, a partner, a poet, a policy advocate, traditional, a board volunteer, and he loves a mean steak and a martini. And one of the reasons I love about this poster too is it combats that stereotype that we somehow all irresponsibly consume alcohol, or that really negative stereotype of the drunken Indian. So check out this art project if you can. There's many, many posters to look at and think about. I'm not going to share with you all of the experiences I've had in psychiatry in terms of racism. I do want to take a moment at the very bottom of the slide to acknowledge, I mentioned I was the first woman, Indigenous woman. The first Indigenous psychiatrist in the country was a fellow named Claire Brandt, who is Wolf Clan from Tyendinaga Mohawk territory in Ontario. It's near Kingston, Ontario. And he was the first. He was born in 1941 and died very young at 53 years of age in 1995. He died when I was in the second year of my residency, and so I never actually got to meet him. And I really can't express how deeply I feel about his loss. And I always make note to mention him where I can, so people are aware of the history, that he was the first. And training as a psychiatrist in the Western medical system in the 1960s or so, 70s, must have been impossible, almost impossible. But Claire did the impossible and worked for many years in and around his community as a psychiatrist. I wrote an article in the CMAJ about him years and years ago called "A Simple Country Doctor," because that's how he liked to see himself. I grew to know some members of his family who supported me early in my career. So we did manage eventually to have a connection. But some of the stereotypes or the racist comments that I've had to endure from being just being born, but in the medical system, are people saying things to me like, "Oh, you're one of the smart ones." When I first moved to British Columbia, Evan Adams and I went to an event and he introduced me to another psychiatrist, and he said, "Oh, you know, Nell just moved here to BC and she's a psychiatrist." And the person sort of looked at me really hard for a number of seconds. It was uncomfortable. And she said, "Like a real psychiatrist, like you're a psychiatrist, like you're an actual psychiatrist." Like she asked me 3 times in like a 2-minute period. And I was thinking, well, what kind of psychiatrist do you think I am? Like, yeah, I'm a real psychiatrist. Things like that. So many other things that I can't get into detail right now, but just around, I think one of the most important ones is during the course of my career, having to advocate for positioning within faculties at times, being overlooked for advancement because of the kind of work that I do. The clinical work that I did on the Six Nations territory, I once super excitedly presented to grand rounds at my department, and I had a psychiatrist colleague come up to me at the end and saying, "Gosh, like with the work you're doing, you probably should have been a social worker." And no offense to social workers, but that was sort of the context in which they looked at my work, which was more holistic and used a 2-eyed seeing approach. Hopefully by now you've all heard of the In Plain Sight report here in British Columbia. So I'm going to skip over these slides because I have 2 more slides that I really want to touch before I finish. That racism is widespread in BC's healthcare system, and it affects outcomes. It's magnified by the public health emergencies I've talked about. And Indigenous healthcare workers, as I've mentioned, face racism in their training and in their work. Those are links on the right-hand side to the full report, the summary report, and the data report. 24 recommendations around systems, behaviors, beliefs, and promoting and strengthening what is called speak up culture. So if you see it, speak up about it. But in order for people to be able to do that, there needs to be a safe environment in place. And maybe we can talk about that more in the Q&A. I use this quote all the time, and I don't know who created it or envisioned it, but these are difficult conversations to have around equity, around racism. When you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. And we hear a lot about that in the work that I do, both with the Indigenous physicians and at FNHA. So I'm almost done. What I want to end with is a tone of saying that we have come not all the way through the pandemic. We're not through with the toxic drug poisoning crisis. Working to eradicate anti-Indigenous racism is an ongoing battle. But I want to highlight, instead of taking a deficit-based approach, we take a strengths-based approach, because resilience means, experiencing adversity, and in the engineering sense, it's springing back. But, First Nations people here in British Columbia say, we're still here. We're going to get through this. We're still here. And so a lot of the messaging that we've done and what we hear about what's happening in communities, the drum on the bottom left is supposed to represent people still being connected with the land despite everything we have been through over the past 15 months. Looking after our wellness, We started something called the Good Medicine Initiative, was people sharing from communities things they were doing to cope, to stay connected, to maintain culture and ceremony, even under the existing public health restrictions. And the picture in the middle, I love that. I pulled that off our VaxChamp campaign, and that's two people pretending that they're in agony because of their vaccines. I'm not sure if that builds vaccine confidence, but looking at their faces makes me laugh out loud. And humor, as you have seen, I hope a little bit throughout my presentation, is not just a coping mechanism. It's one of our strengths. It's how we get by. It's how we get through this. And lastly, I'm going to go back to Murray Sinclair and a statement he made about reconciliation. It's a bit somber, it's a bit difficult, it might make you feel a bit awkward, but it's really important when you're thinking about reconciliation. Reconciliation will not be achieved if one side believes it is based on the recognition of rights and the other believes that it is an act of benevolence. And that's it. I'm sorry I went a little bit over time. I get going and I can't stop myself. But I'm happy to take any questions. Megwich.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wyman, for that really amazing talk. And thank you for sharing your years of experience and the work that you've been doing with the First Nations Health Authority. And especially thank you for that work that you're doing, protecting the health and well-being of Indigenous communities in BC. And that matters, I think, not just for the well-being of Indigenous communities, but I think it matters for the well-being of all of us. So we do have a bit of time for chat or Q&A now. And what we're going to try to do, I'm going to open up the chat. And if you have a question, just put your name in chat. Nathalia Lee, one of the members of the IRC, will be watching the queue and letting you know when it's your turn. So the chat's open now, and if you have a question, go right ahead and put your name in there, and we'll let you know when it's your turn. Also encourage people to go ahead and pop your video on now so we can see some more faces.
Hey, we got a question from Kyle Young. You can go ahead and ask your question. Should be able to unmute yourself.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much, Doctor, for giving this presentation. I was especially interested in the part you mentioned earlier about the Housing First initiative, about giving people housing first and then wrapping them with mental health treatment. I'd just like to hear you describe that at further length, if possible, and just describe how ideally you would like to see that work continued in the future.
Yeah, I think, thanks for that question, Kyle. I think one good place to go to get information is, further information is the Mental Health Commission of Canada that did that project. It was called Chez Soi, which is that French. I can put it into the chat. But there's basically two models, right, that are a little bit different in their approach. One is the Housing First model that I mentioned that I worked at in downtown Toronto, where you take people who are vulnerably housed or homeless, you provide them with housing, and then you provide the supports while they're in place in that housing. And the other one is people who are vulnerably housed or homeless, that you go and do outreach on the street and start engaging them either in mental health services, harm reduction services, and then once they're stabilized, moving them into housing. So it's really interesting to explore those two models. I know Vancouver was one of the sites. At the time, I wasn't living in British Columbia, so I didn't necessarily pay too much attention to the Vancouver site findings at that time, but I would encourage you to go to the Mental Health Commission website and check out the reports from that project.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I see another question in the chat from Christina Lamb, who would like me to speak up more about speak up culture. This is one of the recommendations out of the In Plain Sight report. And what I should mention is, for example, one of the last recommendation in the report was that a provincial task team be struck to propel the recommendations, to track them over time and see that British Columbia is making progress on them. And that work is just about to begin. I've been chatting about being appointed to the task team for a couple weeks now. Apparently I'm not supposed to be, because there's going to be an official announcement. So all of you have to keep my secret for me. But so I'm looking forward to really working on that task team. But speak up culture is really about, if you, for example, if you're a student, if you are put in a situation in a learning environment, say a teacher or professor says something that's racist or behaves toward you in a manner that's racist, that there's got to be a mechanism where you can safely report that. Because probably one of the worst things we have about racism and anti-Indigenous racism is there's a terrible complacency to just forget it, to just let it go, to not speak up about it. And I'm guilty of that myself. You know, when I was a medical student or a trainee, a resident, there were many times. I remember one time I was writing a clinical note on a ward, and a surgeon came onto the floor and looked around and said he wanted something done right away. And he said, you know, well, there's far too many chiefs here and not enough Indians, right in front of me. But he didn't, and he did it not, well, it was a racist comment, but it literally didn't even register on his radar that I could be sitting there in a white coat writing a clinical note in a chart and be Indigenous. But I didn't speak up at the time because I was a resident. He was a staff physician. Like, I had this much power and he had that much power. So what we need to do is create those environments where people can report those incidents when they happen. And let me tell you, I was in a national town hall on Tuesday afternoon on anti-racism, and yesterday talking about anti-Indigenous racism in medical education. And, you know, people have said, you know, like, how do we, you know, well, we're not going to start being, you know, harsh with people, are we? And really, it's like, not being harsh, but there will be consequences at times for people who are behaving in a racist manner. There's regulatory colleges, there's standards that you have to uphold in academic institutions. And sometimes it's not just, you know, the sweet approach that gets people to change their behavior. Sometimes, in some cases, there have to be consequences.
I believe we have Frank. You have a question?
Good morning, everybody. I just want to say thank you, Dr. Wyman. That was such a beautiful presentation. I'm currently at my third year at SFU, and I was actually working towards my Master's of Environmental Science, but for years I was actually wanted to get into psychology and to help our people, because everything you talked about is what I lived through and survived through. I'm through racism daily. And I'm a former drug addict. July 29th will be my 5 years clean. I used to be a hardcore crackhead. So I always like to make fun that I don't want to be the master of the crack pipe anymore. I want to get my master's in university. And all my life, I've never had positive role models like yourself or any other Indigenous people. They're mostly drunks. And wanted to know if I can maybe get some guidance on the proper courses to take and to further my knowledge in helping our people, because I too am happy to stand up to show our fellow people that it is possible to forgive, to live. Oh, sorry. And And for me to stay out of the drug life, I know I have to get an education, and I really need to be around more academic Indigenous people like yourself and Kendera and Sequoia and George and Gary George. So I just want to say I'm really so excited to hear you, and I can't wait to maybe see you one day in real life.
Yeah, hopefully.
So that's kind of just what I wanted to say. I went back to school at 46. I'm 51, so I probably graduated when I'm 70, maybe.
All right. That's all right.
But I'm happy to be here, and I just want to say love and prayers to all you guys.
Very nice to meet you. Congratulations on your recovery.
Thank you so much for that, Frank. And we have, I think, one more, Gary George. I think on the chat you said, what can be done to alleviate the relationship with police and their acts of brutality and racism?
Oh, Gary, that's not an easy question to answer. I thought you'd just say, gee, where do I...
Sorry. I know that's a loaded question, but it seems to come up a lot. It seems to come up like with the anti-Black racism. What I've noticed in the past couple of years is since the advent of surveillance video and other types of video, a lot of it's starting to come out. And I've noticed that, you know, like even myself, you know, when I've been interviewed by students sometimes, and they'll say, well, give me an example of something that's happened. And I'll tell them, because I grew up in the north during Delgamuukw, and some people refuse to believe it. Yeah. They actually refuse to believe that there's all sorts of brutality and racism. And I can talk all day on all the stories I know about what the police have done.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know it's a loaded question.
No, that's okay. I think the one thing that I would say is the In Plain Sight report, for example, is looking at anti-Indigenous racism in the health system. But if we're really going to make a difference, we have to be, we're talking systemic racism. So all of the systems and how they all interrelate. So the justice system, the education system, there's racism in all of those systems. And so we have to work, sort of together on many fronts. And I agree with you. I think with the advent of, phone technology, that people are recording things that happen to them, or witnesses are recording what happened to them. We know it's like the tip of the iceberg, right? Joyce Echaquan, there was a man in a hospital, I think 2 or 3 weeks after Joyce Echaquan died in Quebec, who was treated just as badly, although he survived his illness. His name was Hervé, I can't remember his last name, but he didn't have a video. And so, I think this is holding people to account, but it's really only the tip of the iceberg. And the whole justice system, right? How we're overrepresented, how sentences are lighter, for example. When you look at what happened to Barbara Kentner in Thunder Bay, Ontario, this was the woman that was hit with a trailer hitch and died because of being hit by a trailer hitch. And the fellow was only charged with like a very reduced charge. I can't remember it off the top of my head if it was manslaughter or not, when it should have been murder. Things like that. I mean, there's a lot of work to do, basically. But I think for the policing aspect, I just actually got an email this morning that there is a provincial legislative committee on policing and how police intersect with the mental health system that I just heard about this morning. So we'll follow up on that and find out if we can contribute to that discussion.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. Thanks everyone for those questions. And again, thanks Dr. Wyman. Before we go, I'd like to introduce Candera Bruyere and Mackenzie Braley, two members of the Indigenous Reconciliation Committee.
Thank you so much, Michael, for calling on myself and Mackenzie. Like Michael has already mentioned, my name is Candera Bruyere and I'm Anishinaabe from Saging, Winnipeg, Manitoba. And I'm an undergraduate psychology student here at Simon Fraser University. Here with me virtually is Mackenzie, who is also Indigenous, and she's a graduate student studying neuropsychology. And on behalf of the IRC committee, we would really like to say miigwech to you, Wyman. I'll call you Nell now. And for those students who don't know what this word means, it means thank you in my Anishinaabe language. As students on the IRC, we felt it was important to speak and give you thanks, Nell, as a way to honor the reciprocal relations between elders, teachers, and students. With that said, I'd like to pass it off to Mackenzie, who would like to present you a gift.
Hi, yes, thank you so much. And yeah, on the behalf of the Indigenous Reconciliation Committee at the Department of SFU, we all are super appreciative of your time and for being here. We are presenting you with a scarf here by Lisa Shepherd, who is a Métis artist from Alberta who now lives in BC. And she creates really beautiful Métis garments and fine art. And so this one is called Little Winged Ones. It has like really nice chickadees and canaries and plant-based medicines on it. So that's everything. And thank you so much, Dr. Wyman. Thank you, Nell, so much.
Miigwech.
Okay, thank you all for joining, and thank you so much, Dr. Wyman, for the time that you spent with us today. So there's a lot of things for us to think about. As you said, there's lots of work to be done, but my heart is lifted by the work that you're doing and the fact that we have so many people here today who are with you and are concerned about protecting the health and well-being of Indigenous communities here in BC. So thank you all very much, everyone. Goodbye and take care.